So what years are we talking about here when you're in high school?
The late 60s, and then I graduated in 1970 from high school.
Graduated in 1970. And where were you? Where were
We were
you?
in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
You were in Tulsa. Okay.
Mhm.
So, of course, in the late 60s, we get into 1970. There's a lot of protest, obviously. Kent State in Ohio. We think of California. The upper Midwest, Michigan, and then the East Coast. Do you recall much anti-war activity in Tulsa?
No, no, I really don't. And I think it comes back to just being so self-absorbed. I got out of school early and went to work, and so I was only in class until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had a job, and that was kind of my primary focus at that time. And there was nothing about the war that infiltrated any part of my life other than, like I said, what I just happened to watch in passing as my dad was watching the nightly news, and some interaction that he might have with my mother as it related to those activities.
Yeah. And you were saying a minute ago that, I mean, I picked it up from, or I picked up from what you said, or I have the sense from what you said that your dad was not particularly enthusiastic about the war, or did he?
Well, he really wasn't, I think, just because he had been in World War II. And I remember there were many times we would go through pictures that he brought home. He didn't make it. Oh, he didn't make it. And so there was certainly that concern that one of his boys might end up having to go. And I think that he just wasn't wholeheartedly for it like so many Americans were during World War II, when it really was a national effort that everybody got in there and did their part. And of course, at that point in time, there was all about burning your draft card and going to Canada. And I'm certain that he was probably more making negative comments about those young men that would go to Canada versus doing what he felt was your obligation to your country to join up when you were advised it was your time to go.
Sure. Yeah, and what you've described kind of gets at that real difference. It's hard to believe that it's only one generation removed from Second World War, the Vietnam War. But yeah, I mean, you're describing your own case. I mean, you're working, there's a war going on, but it's not really affecting you. You're carrying on. Whereas, as you said, the World War II generation, the little kids they have less sugar. They're, because you got to conserve for the soldiers. They're going out door to door collecting cans and things like that for the war effort. Everybody's in the war effort. I think that's one of the significant differences between these wars, right? The war your dad was in and the war your husband was in at the time.
Yes, yes, because I'll even use one. I mean, my grandmother would collect blankets, and they would attach the name and number of whomever it was that was donating the blanket, saying, please let us know how you're doing. And of course, those blankets were subsequently distributed to the various military hospitals. And she said it was so nice to sometimes get one of those thank you cards or whatever, or something from whether it was that young man's mother or a family member. Oh, he brought this home and we were so happy that he had this blanket. Those type of things that really did help unite us so much more than what some of the things that were being done, especially as these young GIs came home and were met with very negative comments and actions from the general public.
Yeah. Now, is that something that you've heard about, or did you actually witness some of that yourself? Some of the negativity directed toward?
More what I heard about, listened to on the news, when the war was de-escalating. Of course, we were over there when much of that was going on as far as the de-escalation. So
as you just indicated, so you're in this sort of state where you're well down the road in high school, and you're working and that there's a war on, but it's not really affecting you. Then you just indicated, though, you said you're over there and in the latter part of the war. So over there, meaning where? Where were you?
We're in Okinawa, Japan. It was one of those things that when I first went away to college, and of course in my first semester, Rick and I had talked about marriage, and certainly that was in our wheelhouse and whatever, and I got pregnant my second semester, and obviously we decided to get married. And at that time too, even though he was going to try and stay in school, we realized that, it was a pretty significant expense for my parents to absorb the cost of the pregnancy and whatever. So we made the decision for him to go into the military, knowing that it might just save us the inevitable anyway with him joining the Air Force. He had thought at that point in time he wanted to be in medicine and was thinking to be a large animal vet, but was kind of wobbling back and forth as to whether he'd go into medicine. So when he approached the military and said, I want to be a medic or something in the medical field, and they said, welcomed him with open arms. They thought, come right on in. And through various testings and whatever, subsequently told him that they wanted him to go to language school. And at the time we thought that meant Monterey, California, because by taking Russian, that's where the school was. And they said, oh no, we actually think you have a high aptitude for Vietnamese, and that school is in El Paso, Texas at Biggs Field, which is a far cry from Monterey, California.
Yeah, El Paso and Monterey are a little bit different.
Yes. The weather and very much most everything about it was quite different.
So you and Rick are married what year?
We married, let's see, I guess that would be 71. We married in January of 71.
And then in the Air Force the same year?
Yes. Nikki, our daughter, was born in August of that year. And by that point in time, Rick was already in basic training. So he went on to basic. I moved back in with my parents, had the baby, and then so that by the time she was about 8 weeks old, I was on my way down to El Paso to be with him. Then he finished up language school down there, and we moved, a couple more times because he had to go through various trainings as it related to what they called their prisoner of war type treatment or survival type training that he had to go through prior to being deployed.
Like if he was captured or something, survival school?
Yeah, and it really was, pretty poignant for me because it was only about a 3-week time that he had to go through that, and they fed them much like what he would have been expected to eat. He did drop about 15 pounds while he was there, and he even readily admitted that the only thing that got him through it is knowing that it was going to be over with in, just over a month.
Wow.
And he said it really did kind of, resonate constantly with him. What were all these guys that actually got caught and were over there for, they had no idea of knowing how long, because of course they were completely separated from any communication coming in other than what the Vietnamese were willing to distribute to them. So he said it really was kind of one of those little come to Jesus meetings that you have with yourself periodically, that, just that moment when you kind of begin to grow up and realize that, there's a lot more going on in the world than what we realized.
I would think so. And in 1971, the whole prisoner of war issue is really becoming more and more important. It's, it's being talked about.
Yes. When Jane Fonda did what she did, there's still many people, I might add, I was one of them for a very, very long time. It was very difficult for me to ever show any forgiveness to her for what she had done.
Yeah, going to North Vietnam. And so you're very young, you have a baby, so you're by definition then busy. But do you find yourself paying more attention now to the Vietnam War, or is it still kind of something that's kind of on the side?
Well, yes, you're over there. Of course, when we were in Okinawa, there's one television station, the AFRTS station, which is military, and so you're constantly getting, in the evening news updates and whatever, and then every Friday, and I think this was even something kind of talking jumping back just for a moment, when every Friday when I would walk into history class, the professor that we had, Mr. Brown, would always have a rather large number drawn on the chalkboard, and it was of the number of dead that week. And toward the end of our senior year, I remember walking in, and the largest number was about 432, I think is what it was. And wow. I just thought, oh my gosh, how many, more than almost 100 a day, really, when it came right down to it. Of course, I was really looking even at a 5-day week at that point in time, my Monday through Friday type of in class. And I just sat there and focused on that number the whole hour that we were there. Wow. And think of all the parents and as it happens, I don't want to get too emotional, I have lost a child. The oldest daughter that I had when we were in Okinawa died when she was 25. And so that even resonated with me, even as it relates to Afghanistan now, thinking about those mothers that I was with my daughter when she died, and hear all these people that just get a letter in the mail. One day somebody shows up or something like that. So it was very thought-provoking for sure.
Wow. Your professor, this was in college where the professor would write?
No, actually this was in high school. I said professor, but he was just a teacher.
A teacher. Why did the teacher do that?
I think since it was a history class, just to make us aware, and it was obviously a constant topic of conversation for him about what was going on, even as, with the Watts riots and other stuff that had happened, and just the turmoil that we were having here as much as, what was going on over there. You mentioned your daughter, and we haven't, we're not having this, conversation to talk about that, but can you just tell us her name? Nikki was my oldest daughter's name, Nicole. And then I have a daughter here in Jonesboro. Her name is Tiffany, and she was born in Okinawa. So she was born on a military installation while we were over there. She was born in February of 75, and then we came home and subsequently departed service in May of 75.
Okay. So you at least can identify to some extent then with what it would be like to be a parent of a young person who, we're talking about war, so, a 25-year-old who doesn't come home from war, you at least can identify with the agony of the loss of a child that way.
Oh, yes, because Nikki's been gone now almost 22 years, so when a lot of things were going on in Afghanistan, and, you would hear about young kids, 19, 20, 22, it just was gut-wrenching for me. It was truly like losing her all over again. Very, very emotional time for me.
I'll bet. And I mean, it is kind of incredible actually when you look at my wife and I were just looking at a photograph the other day of some guys who were serving in Vietnam. And both of us said two of them, I think there was a group of like 6, two of them looked like they were 16. I mean, it's hard to believe that our wars are fought by, when you're 18, 19, you don't really recognize how young you are, but you put on a few decades and you look at an 18-year-old, you look at a 19-year-old, you look at a 22-year-old, and it's hard to believe these are the folks who do the fighting.
Yes, that's what's thoroughly amazing, even reflecting back. Now I will be 70 this year, and I look back and think, oh my goodness, I really couldn't have made too many decisions by myself. And I look at those young military guys and understand why the military is so strict as far as their adherence to certain rules and regulations, because they really don't want you doing too much thinking on your own. And I don't mean that in a derogatory type way. They just want you to work in such unison as far as a unit is concerned, and of course having each other's back, and that family type atmosphere, I guess, too. Yeah,
being a team. You said that your husband went to language school, Vietnamese linguist.
Right.
You're in Okinawa, so he doesn't go to country. He's not based in country, based in Okinawa. How much, in general at the time, how much did you know about what his work was in relation to the war?
Absolutely nothing. Because he had a very high security clearance. So he talked, and even if something came up and he just would even put his hand up, meant don't ask, because he was not going to tell. And even when we were at a party, if there was something that one of the fellows might just offhandedly say, then, they'd all just kind of like, no, you don't mention that. Now, it makes no difference if you've had a beer or whatever. You don't say anything, because it was so very hush hush about whatever they were doing. There was even a time when they were really running a lot of missions that something might come up and one of the guys might not be able to make a mission. So somebody would just knock on the door, meaning that all of a sudden they were there to pick up Rick's flight bag and a flight suit. Well, we didn't have a phone, so it was not like he could leave the flight line at that point in time. It just meant that he wasn't coming home that night. He was going to be gone. So it was that type of thing. And the building that he was into, when we went out, it was a place called Torrey Station. It had no windows. It was completely surrounded with a barbed wire fence. And then there was a barbed wire fence within that barbed wire fence. Of course, some of the antennas out. It looked more like a prison than any type of a place where you would expect people to be inside working.
Did you know? So, we know now that he was getting in planes and doing intelligence gathering, above the Vietnamese call it the East Sea, the South China Sea now, right? Mm-hmm. And, listening to communications from the Vietnamese, he had studied, if I understand it correctly, had studied North Vietnamese dialect, so he's picking up these things. So we know that's what he was doing now. He's involved in intelligence gathering in, very long flights. Did you even know that at the time? Did you even know that he was getting into planes?
Oh, no, I knew, yeah, as far as the flight crew and whatever. But it was interesting because once I listened to his interview, that's when I learned a lot about what it was that he was doing. Again, stressing that he never talked about what it was he did. And even once we got out of school, that was something else that was kind of surprising, because while we talked about it to each other, it was very surprising to me that once we got home, even my parents and his parents, something might come up, and if something was mentioned about Vietnam or whatever, or what happened to us in Okinawa, they almost like shut it down. They really didn't want to hear it. And so it was interesting to me to think that I couldn't imagine being a young GI coming home, sitting there talking with my brother or sister or whomever, and parents included, and wanting to open up about something, and then not being able to communicate or there was still that mentality as it related to if you're a man, you don't cry, you suck it up,
right.
Those type of things. Men don't cry, and we realize that being emotional is a vital part of being human.
Sure.
So it was pretty interesting for me that they never wanted to talk about it. Now, Rick and I would periodically, something would come up and it'd go, remember when? And we still had friends that we communicated with that had been over there, and we had some friends up in Chicago that we would go and see. And of course, you'd kind of get together and reminisce and whatever. But it was very surprising that there just seemed to be a total lack of interest about a lot of what went on over there. And when we went over there too, it was right after the island had reverted back to Japanese rule, because if you remember, the United States, that was owned by a principality, I guess, of the United States up until the early 70s. And so while there were talk about riots and that sort of thing, I mean, Rick would get up and he would go to the office or, out to the station. Well, I didn't have a vehicle at that point in time. So here I was with this little 2-year-old. Now, I will say this, it was a great advantage because Orientals, I mean, you're just not going to see any of them with naturally blonde hair. My daughter was very light hair, very curly. So it was quite interesting when we would walk around, people would come and they would get this and they would just reach out for her hair and want to feel the texture of it because it was curly. I'll add a little levity to that too, because when we would go for walks, I had one of these little backpack leash things that would fit on Nikki because that way I didn't have to hold her hand.
Right.
Well, all these little children, because we lived across the street from a school, they would come over and they would surround her and they would just look at her. And of course, obviously they would speak Japanese. Well, Nikki obviously knew no Japanese, nor did I at that time. And so she started barking at them like she was a little dog. So here she was with this leash on, barking at these children. And, oh my goodness, I wish I had video because it truly was hysterical.
I want to come back to your life in Okinawa. Let me just back up real quick. So you know that Rick is getting in a plane, but you don't know where he's going?
Well, not specifically. I mean, I knew that he was going toward Vietnam, but I didn't know where. I mean, I just knew that he was going there,
Did you know that he, I mean, so far as you knew, could he have been, his plane maybe was landing in Vietnam and he was doing something in Vietnam? I mean, did you know that his planes didn't actually touch down in Vietnam, that they, did missions off the coast? Or I guess what I'm wondering is, since you don't know very much, do you find yourself sort of constantly playing the tape of he's in Saigon somewhere, or things like that? I mean, are you coming up with sort of dramas in your mind?
I have to admit, I never truly thought of it simply because he would talk about, I mean, if anything, it was just the length of the flight. That they were in the air for so many hours. And I guess with that, the thought of them landing and taking off, I don't think I ever even questioned him about it. The only time there was a landing and taking off issue is, of course, when we had a typhoon coming in. And, of course, they evacuated all essential military personnel for those flights. And then subsequently, all wives and or husbands that didn't have to evacuate.
Yeah.
We stayed on the island and managed to sit out the typhoons, which was quite interesting because the first thing to go was always the electricity. So you were usually without electricity for 4 or 5 days until they could get that on. While, of course, the guys didn't come back in from their evac until the electricity was back on. So they missed out. Then we always had water rationing because not only did the electricity go out, they shut off the water. So if you knew a typhoon was coming in, you needed to stock up and try to make sure you had some in the refrigerator or try and freeze it as best you could because you knew it would melt a bit, obviously. And just all the things that happen when one comes in and how to prepare. I think, too, one of the devastating things, one of the very first typhoons that we had, of course, somebody came by the house and helped me kind of batten down the hatches, so to speak. But learning after that had moved through that 14 people, all Okinawans, had died. And I thought, oh my gosh, it just never even dawned on me. I was that naive about that I could have died or I could have lost a child or that something significant like that could have happened during that typhoon.
Yeah. It sounds like from what you're saying a couple minutes ago that you did mix with Okinawans.
Well, now I certainly did because, when Rick was away from the house, I wasn't going to just sit there all day. And then quite honestly, I also volunteered in the military dental clinic. Now, we didn't really see that many Okinawans as patients because it was a military installation, but they had so many Okinawans. I think that was part of the agreement that the United States had with mainland Japan when that revision was through, that they would continue to employ so many. And of course they had, whether it was the cleaning people or whatever, because a lot of the dentists were all military personnel, as was much of their support staff. But the one thing too, when the not the de-escalation, but the revision was going on, that there was constant riots at the gates of the military bases because they wanted the GIs off the island. They were not happy, whether it was speeding tickets or whatever, some of the other things that they were doing, which was very negative behavior. It really made the Okinawans irate with some of the conduct of the GIs. So they would riot at the gate. Well, then when they would do a RIF, a reduction in force, that also meant that those employees that were in that particular section of the base, they were let go. And so then again, Zengunro, or Zengunro, I don't remember exactly how to pronounce it, which was the union, would riot again because they wanted the GIs off the island, but they didn't want people to lose their jobs. They wanted them to be absorbed. Yes, it was. Some of the comments that you heard, you're kind of like, okay, wait a second.
Sounds so contradictory.
Both ways. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they didn't want those people to lose their jobs. And, I really couldn't blame them. There wasn't much opportunity there. That island is quite small. So.
Did you go off the base much?
Oh, we didn't live on the base. Did not have a high enough rank. No, we lived it was about a 10-minute walk to get to the base. So when there would be these riots, again stressing, Nikki and me both being blonde, I mean, it was pretty obvious we were American citizens. But God bless them all. I mean, they just never they would get right up in my face or next to me, but I just kept walking. And of course it kind of scared Nikki because, I'd usually pick her up and carry her by this time. Yeah. Or there was, if I kind of walked up the road a bit, there was a military bus that would stop and it would pull on in the base and we could get on there and go to wherever we needed to go. Or we'd get on the bus and just ride it around for a while because it was just something to do. When you're trying to entertain a 2-year-old. Sure. Of course, when I went back to work, again, stressing, that was, even before I got pregnant with Tiffany, she stayed in a daycare and I had a lot of interaction with various people around town and whatever, and just getting out into the community. Plus I was taking Japanese lessons, so it was kind of fun to get out and see if I could use my Japanese, which I don't remember hardly any of it.
So there was some of the rioting and there were some of the tense moments, but it sounds like you also had plenty of amicable interactions as well with.
Oh, absolutely. I quite honestly, I didn't want to come home when we were ready to come home. I had grown so accustomed to that island. It's like a big greenhouse. I mean, it is so humid, and there's so much salt in the air too, or whatever. I mean, you've got to wash your car every day or it'll just rust out from underneath you almost. But it's such a beautiful, lush garden place. And for the most part, unless you're dealing with some of the people that were possibly rioting or one of the GIs off there or had very adverse situations that happened with the GIs. But for the most part, the people were delightful.
You're using the word rioting. I mean, so what do we mean by rioting? Are we talking about people who are yelling outside the base, or are they actually burning stuff down? Or
well, they're not really burning stuff down. I guess maybe the more appropriate word, considering what we see in the United States now as rioting, just more annoying behavior. Oh. I mean, they wore the headbands with what is it, the Rising Star or Rising Sun emblem on there. I mean, they would carry banners and whatever, but and if we drove over there, I mean, you had to go so very slow because they would stand right up next to the car. Now you could move forward and they would move out of the way. They really didn't block your path to the point where you absolutely had to stop, or there was never attempt to beat on the car or any of those type activities that you see now on our nightly news here.
Right.
But and that was pretty much the extent. But there would probably be, I'm going to say, 100 to 200 people outside the gate. So it was a pretty substantial mass of humanity.
Yeah.
It's a two-lane road.
Yeah. So the protests have to do with, I mean, we still hear about this periodically. There are incidents involving American military personnel, and there will be demonstrations calling for the U.S. military to leave Okinawa. Do you remember any of the protests being related to the war, to the Vietnam War itself?
No, I don't remember anything related to the war.
Thing. When you said that you didn't want to go home, you indicated that that's partly because, interestingly, despite the protests, you had become very fond of the place. So that's kind of interesting.
We'd been over there about 30 months by that point in time. And, you're like, I guess you get anywhere. You just kind of get settled in and whatever. But then, and that's one of the joys of the military. You kind of move with your whole neighborhood, because it wasn't like we were the only ones that went over there and all of a sudden you're trying to meet these new people. I mean, we went over there as a military unit. So we already had a bunch of friends, but then more and more people that we would meet out on the economy. I mean, it was delightful to be around those people. What little we understood about their, everything they had to say.
Well, Deborah Benefield, thank you very much for taking the time to share these thoughts. Mostly, I interview the veterans, the military veterans, but it's always good to hear from the spouses, because that's part of the world of war as well. The impact on the family, the impact on the kids, the impact on the spouses. So it's always good to hear about that too.